Welcome back. In a moment, we'll examine Afghanistan's opium trade. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Residents of Bolivia's second largest city, El Alto, have taken to the streets to protest against the government. Residents are calling for building upgrades and have denounced local officials for not carrying out promised improvements to the area. The German government has introduced new legislation which will limit migrant access to its social welfare programs. The move will prevent any German resident from accessing government funding until they've lived in the country for 5 years. And a Pakistani Christian woman on death row for blasphemy has had her appeal adjourned after one of the judges refused to hear the case. Asia Bibi has been on death row since 2010. Blasphemy is a highly contentious issue in the country, and hundreds of police are on standby in the capital, Islamabad. Among the greatest challenges facing modern Afghanistan are the deeply sown seeds of the opium trade. Despite a nationwide crackdown, the country is struggling to kick the habit and remains a world leader in poppy production. This is how opium production looked across Afghanistan in 2015. The south and western areas of the country are the big players when it comes to opium production. Most of the provinces there have at least 1,000 hectares of cultivated land, and several have more than 10,000 hectares. Helmand is the dominant region. It alone has over 30,000 hectares dedicated to the crop. But overall, poppy production is down across the country. The total area under cultivation fell 19% between 2014 and 2015. All three main opium-producing provinces, Helmand, Farah and Kandahar, saw a decrease in production. But despite that, Helmand remains Afghanistan's largest opium producer, accounting for nearly half of the country's crop. Poppies are a lucrative crop, but costly to produce. It requires a skilled labour force and expensive equipment, depending on where they're being grown. If yields and prices aren't high, potential producers won't be inclined to take the risk. Climatic conditions have deteriorated in recent years. Between 2014 and 15, the amount of arable land in Afghanistan decreased by nearly 20%. That's been a problem for agriculture as a whole, as well as poppy growth. Satellite imagery has shown that field quality is poor. Some now point to a shortage of water in key poppy-producing regions as a reason for the fall in production. To discuss this, I'm joined by Jonathan Steele, a former foreign correspondent and author of the book Ghosts of Afghanistan, Hard Truths and Foreign Myths. No myths about the poppy trade, Jonathan. It's still as vibrant as ever?
It's been going for about 30 years. It really began in a big way with the Civil War of the 1980s when the Russians also intervened, and there was no law and order, and it was very easy to develop this kind of trade.
And the Americans, in their leading the intervention, which we marked today, 15 years ago, don't seem to have learnt much from Russian history, their predecessors in the country.
Well, the Russians didn't really do too much about the poppy thing because they didn't have much control of the southwest of the country where, as your map pointed out, Helmand, Kandahar and so on was largely in Mujahideen hands. But it was the Taliban who had 5 years of control, of course, in Afghanistan from 1996 onwards. They reduced the poppy production quite a bit. By the time they left in 2001, it was about 190 metric tons were being produced. Now it's well over 5,000, so it's gone up about 30 times since then. The Taliban did it partly by banning it, because of course in the Quran, like alcohol, drugs are haram, forbidden. Mm-hmm. But they also tried incentives to farmers to give them money to grow other things like onions, like maize, like wheat, and so on.
But the profitability of these things is nothing like it.
The gap
good,
is enormous. I mean, the latest figures seem to be saying that to plant poppy, you get a 12% higher return in terms of cash. Not 12%, 12 times, I mean, higher return in terms of cash than if you plant vegetables or maize.
And in a sense, that economic truth, is that a metaphor for all Afghanistan's problems? Because until that kind of illegal trade and all the profit and all the cash it brings in and the control of those territories, no one government can ever hope to succeed and influence the whole country, can it?
Well, and also you've got Pakistan. I mean, the first time I looked into this issue was in 1997. I was actually in Taliban country in Kandahar with the man who had just recently been appointed head of the UN drugs control operation. And he was trying to argue with the Taliban to cut down, but he was saying, look, it's like a balloon. If you squeeze it in Afghanistan, it gets bigger in Pakistan. If you squeeze it in Pakistan, it gets bigger in Afghanistan. So it's on both sides of the border.
So you need a pan-regional answer to this, rather than just country by country.
And then, of course, the other big argument that is always made particularly 20 years ago, when Afghans themselves hardly actually smoked opium or took heroin, it was all for foreign demand. You've got to reduce demand. You'll only reduce supply if there's no demand.
And the ghosts you refer to in your book, these are who?
Well, they're all the many hundreds of thousands of Afghans who've died over the years of civil war since 1975, and they haunt the country because you know, their deaths still hang over them, and the country is still very, very poor.
The country, their deaths are as futile as, if we look at it rather self-centeredly from the point of view, the British lives that were lost, particularly in Helmand Province. There are literally hundreds of American lives that have been lost in the conflict. Has the whole exercise, do you think, since 15 years ago, been utterly futile?
I think it pretty well has, yes. I mean, there was an argument for not toppling the Taliban. The argument of George W. Bush produced was that they were sort of hosting Osama bin Laden. But Osama bin Laden, by the time of the American intervention, had escaped to the Tora Bora Mountains. He was out of control from the Taliban. Even if they'd wanted to satisfy George Bush and arrest Osama, they couldn't have done it.
But the argument was, we need to intervene in this ungoverned space to protect our homeland, be that the UK, be it Europe, be it United States of America. In order to do that, we must sort out this country. Was that argument always invalid in your view?
Well, I think it was, yes. I think they should never have intervened at all. And then the second mistake was to do this nation-building thing and to pump in all this enormous amount of money into that the country couldn't absorb properly. So, of course, it started to be siphoned off into people's pockets or out of the country to foreign bank accounts. So a lot of that money was wasted. And now you have the Taliban resurgent again. And your previous speakers probably discussed the whole issue of casualties. But, I mean, in 6 months this year alone, from March to August, 4,500 Afghan police and army soldiers were killed. That's more than the West lost, British and American deaths, in the whole of 10 years. So the casualty rate is just colossal. If there was a disengagement, would you believe that Afghanistan, left to its own devices, despite the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, all being known to be in this territory and all the questionable relations with bits of Pakistan, can it run its own affairs? Could it be a successful country? Well, from a security point of view, I mean, Al-Qaeda is now dispersed around the globe, particularly around the Middle East and North Africa, and so is ISIS, which is a sort of offshoot originally from Al-Qaeda. So from the security point of view, Afghanistan is not important anymore. Most of the world's terrorists are no longer there. But from the Afghan citizens' point of view, you know, the country is still a complete mess, and there's massive unemployment. That's why so many people seek refuge abroad. I mean, some of them are migrants who are economic migrants, and some of them are political refugees. But there is very little future, and a lot of the younger people, the best and the brightest, who have languages and so on and had good jobs when the occupation was there, the British and American occupation. Now, of course, they don't have those jobs, and of course, they're emigrating too. Jonathan Steele, thank you very much indeed. We're going to end our programme with our Insight Bite. This is just a little something that we feel you should know. And today, it's ordinary members of the Spanish public going to extreme lengths to honour members of the armed services. As part of the country's National Day, the Spanish Defence Ministry asked the public to film themselves taking part in a 22-day push-up challenge. Well, members of the Spanish Army have decided to take this challenge one step further and do it underwater. This form of military salute began on social media months ago, but none has been as brave or as bizarre as this effort, at least so far. And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.